The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the sound of dripping water inside the cave. The air smelled of stone and ash, and the ground trembled every few moments as if something massive was moving outside. The princess sat on the cold floor, her wrists chained to the rock wall, her eyes dull but unyielding. For days she had waited in this dark prison, listening to the beast's growl echo in the distance, knowing one day it would come for her. Her people believed she was already gone, her kingdom had fallen to fear, and her guards were crushed in the first battle. She was alone now, with no knight, no sword, and no hope. But still she breathed, still her heart beat, though every moment whispered that death was near. The ground shook again, dust falling from the ceiling. The beast was close, closer than ever before. Her chains rattled as she tried to pull back, but they held firm, cold iron biting into her skin. She whispered a prayer to the stars she could not see, her voice trembling. "If anyone can hear me, let this not be the end." From the shadows at the cave's mouth, a figure staggered forward. It was not a knight in shining armor, not a warrior with banners or glory. It was a man, wounded, bleeding, his clothes torn, and his bow cracked from battle. His steps were weak, but his eyes burned with fire. The princess stared, unable to believe. He was only human, no crown, no title, no shining sword. Yet there he was, standing where none dared stand. He carried a bow, and in his hand was a single arrow, the last of his quiver. The man looked at her, his chest rising with labored breath. "You're still alive?" he whispered, almost in disbelief. The princess nodded slowly, fear and hope mixing in her heart. She wanted to speak, to beg him to run, but the words stuck in her throat. Behind them, the cave shook harder. A roar thundered through the stone. The beast was awake, its heavy steps crashing closer and closer. The man turned his head, his jaw tightening. He knew what was coming, and he knew he did not have time. He limped closer to the princess, kneeling beside her chains. "I can't break these," he said, his fingers touching the iron. "Not yet." His voice was tired, but it carried strength. He raised his bow and lifted the arrow, staring into the darkness. The princess whispered, "You cannot fight it. You will die." The man smiled faintly, though blood dripped from his lip. "Then I will die standing," he said, "but maybe, just maybe, I can give you a chance." The cave mouth shook again, stones falling. The shadow of the beast spread across the walls, massive and terrifying. Its roar was like thunder tearing the air, its eyes glowing with hunger. The princess shivered, her breath caught in her chest. The man did not move, his hands steady on the bow. He planted his feet, ignoring the pain that twisted through his broken body. He knew he had one arrow, one chance, and nothing more. The silence between roars stretched thin, like the string of his bow. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause. The princess's heart raced, her eyes locked on him. In that fragile silence, in that endless darkness, the human stood as if carved from stone. Not a hero by birth, not a savior by destiny, but a man who refused to surrender. She realized then that this was not about kingdoms or crowns. It was about courage, the kind that could rise even when hope was gone. Her fear eased, replaced by a strange warmth. For the first time since her capture, she believed there might still be light. The beast roared again, its massive body pressing into the cave, shaking stone and earth. The princess closed her eyes, waiting for death. But instead of despair, she heard the man whisper, almost like a vow. "This arrow is not just mine. It is for every soul this beast has taken." She opened her eyes, and in the glow of the beast's fire-lit eyes, she saw him draw the bowstring. The sound was soft, but it carried more weight than the beast's roar. The arrow gleamed faintly in the dim light, fragile yet unbroken. The man's gaze was sharp, his breath steady, his will unshaken. The cave trembled as the beast lunged. But the man did not falter. He stood between the monster and the chained princess. The last hope of a fallen kingdom, with nothing left but one arrow in his unyielding heart. And as the darkness swallowed them, the princess felt it. The moment when fear gave way to faith. The moment when one human's defiance lit a spark brighter than all her kingdom's lost fire. The end was not yet written, and though she was chained, though the beast loomed, she knew. Hope had returned, carried by a wounded man and his last arrow. The cave was shaking under the weight of the beast's steps. Each thud rolled through the stone like a drum of doom. The chains rattled against the princess's wrists, the cold iron biting harder with every vibration. Her eyes stayed on the man, the strange human who had appeared when all seemed lost. He stood tall despite the blood dripping from his shoulder. His body bore wounds of battles fought and lost, but his spirit refused to bend. The bow in his hand was cracked along the edge, yet still strong enough to carry one last arrow. His grip on the string was steady, his gaze fixed on the black opening of the cave. The princess whispered again, fear choking her words, "You cannot stop it." "No one can." The man only glanced at her, his eyes burning with quiet fire. "I do not need to stop it forever," he said, his voice low. "I need only one moment, one chance." She did not understand how one broken man could fight what armies had failed to kill, but his conviction shook her more than the beast's roar. From the shadows came a blast of hot breath, thick with ash and decay. The beast was near, its roar splitting the cave and sending rocks tumbling down. The man did not flinch. Instead, he stepped forward, planting himself between the monster and the chained princess. His back was bent but unbroken, his body frail but his spirit fierce. Memories flashed through his mind, his comrades falling one by one under the claws of the beast. He saw their faces, their last cries, the blood soaking the ground. He remembered his commander shouting that the kingdom was lost, that retreat was their only option. But he had not retreated. He had crawled through fire and darkness to reach this place, carrying only his bow and a single arrow. The princess's eyes widened as the glow of two burning eyes filled the cave. The beast finally appeared, its massive head pushing through the stone arch, horns scraping the ceiling. Its body was a mountain of muscle, its claws carving deep into the floor with every step. Its roar was so loud that the cave seemed to crack apart. The man raised his bow, his arm trembling not from fear, but from exhaustion. He knew that this was not a battle of strength, for strength he did not have. It was a battle of timing, of precision, of heart. He whispered to himself, "One shot, nothing more." The beast lunged, its claws slashing through the air like falling blades. The man rolled aside, stones cutting his skin, but he kept his bow raised. The princess screamed as the monster's tail smashed against the wall, sending shards flying. But the human did not scream. He gritted his teeth and stood again. His mind cleared, every sound fading except the thunder of his own heartbeat. He looked at the princess, her chains glimmering in the dim light, her face pale but filled with something new. Hope. That hope gave him strength, enough to steady his arm once more. He aimed not at the beast's claws, not at its chest, but at its glowing eye, the one place he believed the arrow could pierce. The beast roared and charged again, faster, louder, unstoppable. The man drew his bowstring back, the wood creaking under the strain. He knew that this was his final breath, his final stand. If he missed, both he and the princess would be torn apart within seconds. The ground quaked, dust filled the air. The chains cut deeper into the princess's skin as she braced for death. But through the storm of noise and fear, she heard his voice, steady, unwavering. "This is for every fallen warrior," he whispered. "This is for the kingdom. This is for life." His arrow glowed faintly in the firelight of the beast's burning eyes. He let it rest for a heartbeat, and in that heartbeat the world stood still. The cave, the roar, the chains, even the princess's fear, all faded. There was only the man, his bow, and the target before him. The beast lunged again, its jaw wide, fangs glistening with saliva. The man exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing, his body frozen in perfect focus. The bowstring hummed like a final song of defiance. And as the monster's shadow engulfed him, the arrow was ready to fly. The arrow was loosed, slicing through the choking air of the cave. For a moment it seemed too small, too fragile against the mountain of muscle and rage that bore down upon them. But it struck, the tip flashing as it buried itself deep into the beast's burning eye. The creature let out a roar so violent that the stone walls trembled and the ground cracked beneath their feet. The princess gasped, her chains rattling as she pulled back against the wall. The sound of the beast's agony filled the cavern like thunder, echoing in waves that rattled her bones. The human staggered but did not fall, his bow now empty in his hand. Blood dripped down his arm. Yet his gaze remained locked on the monster he had dared to defy. The beast thrashed wildly, its claws tearing gouges into the rock, its tail smashing pillars of stone. The cave shook as if it would collapse, dust and debris falling in showers. The princess cried out as boulders crashed around her, sparks flying from the chains that bound her. The human dove to shield her, his body slamming into hers as a rock shattered against the ground where she had been sitting. His breath was heavy, his body weak, but still he forced himself up again. The beast's roar turned into a shriek, its single glowing eye blazing with fury. The arrow had not killed it, but had wounded it, enough to drive the creature into blind rage. It clawed at its own face, trying to rip the shaft free, spraying dark blood across the stone. The man knew he had bought only moments, not victory. He had no arrows left, no weapon sharp enough to pierce its hide. And yet he stood, placing himself once more between the beast and the princess. His shadow stretched long across the cave floor, small but unbroken against the storm. The princess stared at him, her chest rising with quick breaths. In his trembling stance, she saw no fear, only resolve. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "Why? Why do this for me?" He did not look back at her, his eyes locked on the monster. "Because someone must," he said simply. The beast slammed its claws into the ground, sending a shockwave through the cavern. The human was thrown to his knees, but he pushed himself up again. Every muscle screamed in protest, every wound burned, but he would not yield. The princess could feel the heat of the beast's breath rushing past her, the stench of death curling around her like smoke. The darkness grew thicker as the firelight from the beast's eyes flickered against the walls. The man's silhouette seemed impossibly small, a fragile figure against a nightmare of flesh and shadow. And yet the cave felt alive with his defiance, as though the walls themselves waited for his next move. The princess's heart pounded with a rhythm that matched his courage. In that storm of terror, she realized she was no longer waiting for death. She was waiting for him. The beast lunged, jaws wide, saliva dripping from its fangs. The man dove aside, rolling across jagged stone, his hands bleeding from the sharp edges. He grabbed a broken piece of rock, wielding it like a blade, though it was little more than a shard. With a shout, he struck at the beast's face, sparks flying as stone clashed against bone. The creature bellowed again, smashing its head into the wall. The cavern groaned, cracks racing along the ceiling as dust rained down. The princess screamed his name, though she did not know it, only that he was her shield, her last hope. The human staggered, his weapon shattering in his hand, but his spirit still unbroken. The shadows twisted with the beast's rage, the light of its eye casting monstrous shapes along the cave walls. The human stood once more, chest heaving, eyes burning. The princess felt her chains like fire against her wrists, every heartbeat telling her that she must be free. But the iron held her fast, and she could only watch, trembling, as man and monster circled in the dark. The clash was not of equals, but of will against power. One was a beast of nightmare, the other a broken man with nothing left but courage. The cave became a storm of dust and blood, of roars and ragged breath. And through it all, The princess saw something she had never seen before, hope burning in the heart of a human who refused to fall. The beast's rage shook the cavern like thunder. Its claws carved trenches into the stone as it flailed, blinded on one side, the arrow still buried in its glowing eye. The air filled with dust and the sharp stench of blood, making every breath burn like fire. The princess pulled against her chains until her wrists bled, her heart pounding with helpless fury. The human stood, swaying from exhaustion, his bow shattered in his grip. He had no arrows left, nothing but broken rock and bleeding hands. Yet his gaze did not waver, locked on the monster as if his will alone could hold it back. His chest rose and fell in ragged rhythm, but his spirit burned brighter than the cave's dim light. The beast roared and charged, its massive body smashing through stone. The man barely escaped its claws, rolling across the jagged floor, pain tearing through his side. He pressed his palm against the wound, feeling the warm flow of blood, but he did not stop. Instead, his eyes searched the debris, desperate for anything that could become a weapon. Among the rubble, his hand touched something familiar, an arrow, cracked and bent, half buried beneath fallen stone. It was not sharp, not strong, but it was an arrow nonetheless. He picked it up with trembling fingers, as if fate itself had offered him one last chance. The princess saw him rise again, bloodied but unbroken, clutching the broken shaft. Her voice shook as she cried out, "You cannot! Please, you will die!" He turned his head just slightly, enough for her to see the faintest smile. "Then I will die as I choose," he whispered, "but not before I strike once more." The beast lunged, its fangs snapping inches from his face. The man thrust himself aside, narrowly avoiding the crushing bite. He slammed his shoulder into the wall, pain exploding through his bones, yet his grip on the arrow did not falter. The cavern echoed with the clash of will and power, a fragile man against a nightmare of flesh. He lifted the broken arrow, raising it high though his arm shook. It was not sharp enough to pierce scales, not strong enough to cut flesh. But he aimed not for flesh. He aimed for the wound already carved, the place where the first arrow still burned. His eyes narrowed, his breath slowed, and for a heartbeat the chaos around him disappeared. The princess stared, her fear swallowed by awe. She saw not a soldier, not a warrior of legend, but a human who refused to bow. His shadow stretched across the broken stones like a banner of defiance. In that moment she understood. Courage itself was sharper than steel. The beast roared and came again, its single burning eye fixed on him. The man sprinted forward, every step a war against his failing body. He leapt onto a fallen stone, then another, climbing toward the monster's head as it struck. His hand clenched tighter around the broken arrow, his teeth gritted in defiance. The cave shook as the beast smashed against the walls, trying to throw him off. The princess screamed his name, though she did not know it, her voice carrying hope and terror both. The human clung to the creature's ridges, pulling himself higher, closer to the wound. Blood sprayed across his face, hot and blinding, but he did not stop. At last he reached it, the arrow still buried in the beast's eye, pulsing with dark fire. He raised the broken shaft in his hand, his voice rising above the roar of the monster. "This is the end," he cried, "for you, not for us." And with every shred of strength left in him, he drove the arrow deeper. The beast let out a scream that shattered stone. Its body convulsed, thrashing with such fury that the cavern ceiling cracked and boulders rained down. The human was thrown clear, his body slamming against the ground, blood splattering the dust. The princess cried out, her heart tearing as she saw him lie still. But the beast staggered, its roars faltering, its massive form crashing against the cave walls. The wound glowed with searing light as the broken arrow burned deeper into its skull. The monster clawed at its own face, but it was too late. Its strength faltered, its roars faded, and the ground shook as its body collapsed. Silence fell, broken only by the echo of falling stones. The princess trembled, tears burning her eyes, unable to believe what she had seen. A single human, broken and alone, had brought the beast to its knees with nothing but defiance and a broken arrow. And though the cave was dark, for her it felt filled with light. The cavern was silent after the beast's fall. Only the sound of crumbling rock and dripping water echoed through the dark. The monster's massive body lay motionless, its glowing eye dimming to ash. The air was heavy with smoke and the stench of blood, but for the first time in days, the roar of death was gone. The princess could hardly breathe, her chest rising with quick, trembling gasps. Her eyes fixed on the figure lying near the rubble, the human who had stood against the beast. His body was broken, his arm twisted, his chest rising weakly with shallow breath. He had given everything, and she feared he had no more left to give. Tears welled in her eyes, not from fear, but from grief. She pulled against her chains with all her strength, ignoring the pain as the iron cut into her skin. Her voice broke through the silence, calling out to him, "Do not leave me, please." The words carried more weight than any command of royalty. They carried desperation. The man stirred faintly, his eyes opening just enough to meet hers. A faint smile touched his lips despite the blood. "You are alive," he whispered, his voice no stronger than a breath. She nodded, tears falling down her face. "Because of you." The chains rattled again as she struggled, her wrists raw and bruised. The human forced himself to move, dragging his battered body closer to her. Each motion was agony, yet he did not stop. With trembling fingers, he reached for the iron binding her. His hands were too weak to tear the chains, yet he tried again and again. The princess shook her head. "You cannot. You must rest." But his eyes burned with that same fire she had seen before. "No," he whispered, "not until you are free." He pressed his hand against the lock, blood smearing across the rusted metal. Then, from the rubble nearby, he grabbed a jagged stone. With every ounce of strength left in him, he struck at the lock. The cave echoed with the sharp clang of stone on iron, again and again. At last the lock cracked, snapping apart under his relentless effort. The chains fell away, clattering onto the ground. The princess gasped, her hands free for the first time since her capture. She reached for him, steadying his broken body as he collapsed against her. Her fingers brushed his blood-stained hair, her heart breaking at the sight of him. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Why would you give so much for me?" He coughed, each breath a struggle, yet his smile did not fade. "Because hope is worth dying for," he said, "and you are hope." The words struck her deeper than any blade. For so long she had believed herself doomed, nothing more than a symbol of failure. But in his eyes, she was more. She was the light worth protecting. Her tears fell onto his skin, mingling with the blood and dust. She pulled him close, wrapping his broken body in her arms. For the first time since her capture, she no longer felt powerless. The chains were gone, the beast was dead, and before her lay the man who had made it possible. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "I will not let you fall, not after all you have done." The cavern groaned around them, the beast collapsed, having weakened the stone. But the princess did not flinch, her strength born from his sacrifice. She lifted him with all the power her body could muster. Though small compared to the fallen monster, she carried a weight far greater, his life. Step by step, she moved through the rubble, the human clinging faintly to her. The cave was filled with smoke and shadow, yet ahead she saw the faint shimmer of light. Her heart pounded with a new rhythm, not fear but determination. The princess was no longer waiting for rescue. She was carrying it with her. Behind them, the beast's body burned, sparks flickering in the dark like dying stars. The princess glanced back only once, her eyes fierce and unyielding. The nightmare had ended, and in its place a story had begun, not of a kingdom saved by armies, but of a single man whose last arrow had changed fate. As she carried him toward the faint light of freedom, the princess whispered a vow. No chain will bind me again. No shadow will claim what you have given. Her voice was soft but firm, echoing in the silent cavern. And though the man's eyes fluttered closed, his faint smile remained. The princess was free, but her freedom was not hers alone. It was carved by the courage of a human who defied the impossible. And as the darkness faded behind them, she knew the story of this moment would live forever. For she would never forget the man who gave her more than rescue. He gave her hope. The air outside the cavern was sharp and cold. After endless days of darkness, the princess squinted against the faint light of dawn. Her body trembled from exhaustion, yet she held the human tightly, refusing to let him fall. Every step through the rubble felt like carrying the weight of a kingdom. Behind her, the cave still groaned, stones collapsing where the beast had drawn its last breath. But ahead was the horizon, pale with the promise of morning. The princess staggered into the open, her chains dragging behind her like ghosts of the past. She dropped to her knees on the grass, holding the wounded man close. The village below the mountains stirred at the sight. Fishermen and farmers looked up, eyes widening as they saw their princess alive. Word spread like wildfire through the valley, and soon people were running, gathering, shouting. "The princess lives," they cried. "She has returned." Soldiers who had once fled now rushed to her side. They bowed in awe, not to her crown, but to the broken man she carried. For they saw the blood on his body, the scorch marks on his hands, and they knew the truth. One human had done what armies could not. The princess laid him gently on a cloak, her hands trembling as she pressed against his wounds. His breath was faint but steady, his chest rising like a fragile flame, refusing to die. She whispered to him even as tears ran down her face, "Stay with me. You are not allowed to leave me now." Her people gathered in silence, watching with reverence as she spoke not as a ruler, but as a woman saved. Old healers came running, their herbs and bandages ready. They worked quickly, pressing poultices to his wounds, tying cloth around his chest. The princess never moved from his side, her hand always clutching his. Her heart prayed silently with every breath he took. The people murmured around them, their voices filled with awe. "Who is he?" they asked. "Not a knight, not a prince, not one of us." But the answer was written in their hearts as they looked upon him. He was the savior, the last arrow, the courage they had lost. The king, broken with grief for days, came forward at last. His crown seemed heavy, his face lined with sorrow that melted into wonder. He looked at his daughter, free and alive, and then at the man who had brought her back. He knelt, placing his hand on the human shoulder. "Our lives are his gift," he said. The people wept openly, not from sorrow, but from relief. They knelt too, surrounding the wounded hero with reverence. The valley that had once echoed with the beast's roar now rang with voices of gratitude. The air itself seemed lighter, as though the chains had fallen not just from the princess, but from them all. The princess lifted her head, her eyes fierce though wet with tears. "This man is no stranger," she declared, her voice carrying over the crowd. "He is the shield that stood when all else fell. He is the fire that burned when hope was gone." Her words bound the people together, stronger than iron. They built a litter from wood and cloth, carrying the wounded hero back to the castle. The streets filled with people, flowers and tears falling upon his path. Children reached out to touch his hand, elders whispered blessings. It was not a parade of victory, but a procession of gratitude. Inside the castle, the princess stayed beside him day and night. The healers worked tirelessly, though they feared his wounds were too deep. She never wavered, whispering stories of hope, of life, of the light he had returned to her. Her voice was soft but unyielding, a chain that pulled him back from the edge of death. And though his eyes stayed closed, his hand sometimes moved, squeezing hers faintly. Each time her heart soared, for it was proof that his fire had not gone out. The people lit candles across the kingdom, every home glowing with prayers for the human who had saved them. Hope spread faster than any fear ever had. At last the kingdom stood not in shadow, but in light. The beast was gone, but more than that, despair was gone. It had been slain not by armies or kings, but by one man who had stood when all else had fallen. And in that truth, the princess saw the rebirth of her people. She kept her vow close to her heart as she sat beside him, that his sacrifice would not be forgotten, that his courage would not be buried with silence. Every beat of her heart carried his name, though she had never asked it. 4 names mattered less than deeds, and his deed would live forever. Days turned into weeks, and the kingdom slowly healed. The broken walls of villages were rebuilt. The cries of mourning faded into songs of life. Yet through all the work and celebration, one story rose above all others. The story of the human, the last arrow, the man who defied the beast. The princess never left his side as he lay within the castle walls. His wounds were deep, his body scarred, but life clung to him like a stubborn flame. Each day the healers tended to him. Each night she whispered to him, urging him to fight on. And though his voice was weak, his spirit answered in small ways. An opened eye, a trembling smile, a hand that refused to let go of hers. The people came from across the land to see him. Farmers, soldiers, children, even the old who had thought hope lost. They left flowers, food, and prayers outside his chamber. They spoke his name with reverence, though many did not know it, for his true name had become unnecessary. To them he was the arrow, the last defiance, the savior who stood when kings could not. And so the legend grew, carried from village to village, sung in taverns and whispered around fires. Even those who had never seen his face knew of him, the human who had risen in the darkest hour and struck down the nightmare. When at last he was strong enough to walk, the princess stood beside him before the people. His steps were slow, his body still marked by scars, but his presence was stronger than ever. The crowd fell silent, a sea of eyes fixed upon him. And in that silence the princess lifted his hand high, her voice clear and unshaking. "This man is not only my rescuer," she declared, "he is the rescuer of us all." Her words rang through the courtyard, echoing against stone and sky. The beast is gone, but his courage lives in us. It is the fire that cannot be broken, the light that cannot be chained. The people cheered, their voices rising like thunder, not of fear, but of joy. A great monument was built at the edge of the valley. Upon it was carved the image of a bow and a single arrow. Beneath it the words were etched, for the one who stood when hope was lost. It was not a grave, for he still lived, but a reminder that legends are born in courage, not in crowns. The princess kept the broken arrow that had pierced the beast's skull. She wore it across her chest, not as jewelry, but as a vow. Whenever she looked upon it, she remembered the chains that had once bound her and the hands that had broken them. And she remembered the voice that told her hope was worth dying for. As years passed, the tale became greater than history. Children played with wooden bows, calling themselves the last arrow. Soldiers trained with the fire of his defiance in their hearts. And the kingdom stood not only stronger, but braver. The human himself asked for no reward. When people bowed, he only shook his head. When they called him savior, he only smiled faintly. He lived simply, walking among them, teaching that courage was not about never fearing, but about standing in spite of fear. And the people loved him more for it. The princess, however, carried her own vow. She had been saved not only from chains, but from despair. And she swore that as long as she breathed, his name and his story would never fade. Her rule was not built on power, but on the light his defiance had given. And so, when her voice carried across the land, the people listened, not because she was a princess, but because she was the one who walked beside the human who had changed their fate. Together, they became a symbol of unity, proof that hope could be born even from ruin. Proof that sometimes the greatest strength came not from armies, but from a single heart. The legend of the last arrow was carried far beyond the borders of the kingdom. Travelers took it to distant lands, bards sang it across seas. And wherever the tale was told, people sat a little taller, stood a little firmer, believed a little deeper. For they knew that even when all seems lost, one act of courage can change everything. And so the princess's final words, spoken at the monument, became eternal. "No one will forget," she said, her hand resting on the carved stone. "No one will forget the human who defied the beast. No one will forget the last arrow that gave us back our light." And with those words, the story was sealed, not just in stone, but in every heart that would ever hear it.